So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Day to Day Around the House. In this video, I had my garage door opener stop working. It would not work electronically or with the manual override, and I'm going to show you how I fixed it. What would happen is you'd hit the push button for the electric garage door opener. It would lift about 2 inches or so and then quit because it was getting overloaded. Once getting a look at it, I noticed that the torsion spring was completely broken, which is what assists in lifting the weight of that garage door. So my torsion spring was a left-hand spring. This meaning that if you're standing inside the garage looking at the garage door, that spring is off to the left-hand side of center. So I snapped a couple pictures of my garage door, the location of the spring, and the numbers that were on it. This is the main number you will need. I ended up going online and finding a garage door parts supplier that was pretty close to my house, and I ended up getting the spring there. Now I did get one that was 1 inch longer, so it was a 250 by 2 by 30. This was my old one, and it was a 250 by 2 by 29. You can also go on Amazon, and I did find the same spring with the winding bars that you should use and the center support bearing for $40 less than what I paid at the parts supply store in town. Now, if you do have a right-hand spring, this video will still work. Just concept's going to be a little bit reversed. If you have a dual spring, meaning there is a spring on each side of center of the garage door, this video does go over everything you need to know to change out a spring if you do have a dual setup. The only difference is, because I had a single spring and it was broke, I did not have to unwind the tension off of the other spring before disassembly, and I didn't have to wind 2 springs up during assembly. In my opinion, a 2-spring setup is a better way to go, because there would be a more balanced load on the center bearing because it's between the 2 springs instead of completely off to the side of the one. The other big advantage to a dual spring setup is the springs tend to be a little lighter duty because the weight of the garage door is split between 2 springs instead of just one, and therefore preloading and having to take the load off of that torsion spring would be a lot easier in a dual spring setup. The other thing is, if you lose one of the 2 springs on a dual spring setup, you still have that other spring helping lift 50% of that weight, whereas if a single spring breaks, you actually have to lift the entire door weight by yourself trying to get it open manually. Now, most of this project is very easy to do. However, there is one specific part that is very dangerous, and if you're not confident in your abilities, I recommend calling a professional to do it, and that is loading the spring tension on this torsion. Now, this was my first time replacing one of these torsion springs on the garage, and I'm going to go over everything I did step by step, including the tools you'll need, helpful tips, and mistakes I made, so hopefully you guys don't make those same mistakes that I did. Now, if this spring ever breaks on me again, I will be upgrading to a 2-spring setup for the reasons I just discussed, and it's not that big of a deal to upgrade to that setup. So when initially finding this problem, I did do some searching online, and I found this Garage Door Nation online. Not only can you get parts for your garage door, but they also have helpful guidelines and charts to make sure you get the right parts and how to install them. And is a good second source of information if you end up needing it for whatever reason. So let's get to it. So there is a couple safety precautions that need to take place before getting started with this project. The first thing is you should unplug your garage door opener so somebody doesn't have a remote and opens it up while you're working on it. That could be bad. You can also put a pair of vice grips above the rail of one of the wheels in the track to keep it from possibly coming up. This also comes in handy when you're loading the spring so the door doesn't start lifting up while you're doing that. So all garage doors have a manual release handle so that if your electric garage door opener quits working, you can still go up and down with that garage door. So you want to make sure that your garage door is all the way laying against the ground when you pull this, and this is what happens if you're up in the air a little bit. This was the first stupid mistake that I did make during this project, not realizing how heavy these garage doors actually were. There was a lot of tension on that mechanism because the spring was broken. Now, the reason it was up that couple of inches is because we hit the garage door opener to try and open it, and it overloaded at that point and quit because the spring was broken. So what I should have done is hit it again to make it go back down, and then I would have been safe to pull that handle and release the door. So I had 2 reasons for wanting to release that manual handle. One is the garage door was up in the air a little bit, and it needs to be fully against the ground in order to do this project. And the other was I was thinking I was going to be able to lift it up manually and get my car out of the garage. I even had my daughters help me try and lift that garage door up all the way, and it just ended up being too heavy, so we ended up just pulling the car forward a little bit to give me enough room to work. So on this torsion spring, there are 2 set screws that hold that torsion spring to the rod. I used a 3/8 wrench to loosen these set screws. You could also use a crescent wrench or a 7/16 square drive socket, works well. Now obviously because my spring is broken, there is no tension on this rod right now, but if you were to loosen these set screws and your spring was good, that's going to unwind very quickly and can be very dangerous. So please make sure that you have no tension when loosening those set screws off of that rod. There's a couple good ways to verify this. The first is you can grab the rod by hand and it should spin freely. The other is you can look at the drums that hold the cables that attach to the bottom of the door on each side and make sure that that cable is loose and has some slack in it. Now, if your door does have dual springs, meaning there's a spring on each side of the center bracket, then you will need to release the torsion off of the good spring because the chances of it breaking both springs at the same time is practically zero before you start any type of disassembly to replace the one that is bad. And I will be going over winding and unwinding the springs more later in this video. Once those were loose, I went to the other side of the torsion spring and removed the 2 bolts that held that side of the spring to the center bracket of the garage. On each side of that rod, there's going to be a pulley with a cable that attaches to the bottom of the garage door. In order to replace the spring, you will need to loosen the set screws on both of those pulleys so you can slide that rod out of the one side in order to remove the old spring and put the new spring on. These set screws were the same size as the torsion spring, so I used that 3/8 wrench. Once both of those pulleys were loose, I was able to slide that rod about a foot over to the one side of the garage, and that gave me enough room to remove the spring. Now normally I would say this torsion spring should just slide right off of that rod, but there was a sticker on that rod that made it a little bit of a tight fit, and I did have to use a rubber mallet and able to assist me in getting it past that sticker on the rod. As I moved that torsion spring along that rod, I did have to push the rod a little bit further towards the one side of the garage to give me enough room to get the spring completely off of the rod. You might also have some indentations where the set screws dug into the rod and produce some high spots on that rod. If you take a file and file down the high spots on the rod, it will also make it easier to slide that torsion spring off of the rod. So there's a little plastic bushing that rides in that center bracket. That did not come with the new spring, so I did have to remove it out of the old spring and slide it onto the rod before putting the new spring in place on the rod. That bushing will basically pop into the one side of that torsion spring. Depending on where you got your spring, it might come with it already in it, or it might come in the kit that you bought, and you will just replace that bushing with the new bearing. I held that side of the torsion spring up in place and went ahead and put the nuts and bolts back through the torsion spring and through the center bracket of the garage. So previously they just had a bolt and a nut that held this bearing on the torsion spring to that center bracket. I'm a big fan of using washers and lock washers, so I did add those to these 2 bolts to give it a little extra holding strength. At this point, I just put the bolts in to hold it, but not tighten them down yet. Upon disassembly, one of the cables came out of the pulley, but that's not a big deal. There's just a groove that it fits into, and then it is easy to tell which way that cable is supposed to wind on that pulley. Once attaching the cable to the pulley, I slid the pulley onto that rod and then threw the bearing in the bracket on the side of the garage. So you can see the wear spot where it was in the bearing, so we're just going to go right back to that spot. Once putting the rod in position, then I just moved the pulley over to that bearing. The pulleys are what are responsible for holding that rod from falling out of one side or the other. So the cable on the left-hand side of my garage door did get jammed up between the frame of the house and the garage door, and I had to use a pry bar in order to spread it open a little bit to get that cable loose. Before tightening the set screws on that pulley, you're going to want to wind up the slack in that cable. This is a very critical step because if you don't have equal cable tension on each side, the garage door might bind up and you might overload your garage door opener. Once you have wound the cable pretty snug on the drum, then you're going to want to tighten those set screws down. When tightening those down, you're basically going to go in with the set screw until you feel it hit the rod, then go another half turn, do the same thing with the other set screw, and then go another quarter turn on the other one and back to the other one with a quarter turn as well. Once you've got a snug fit on the cable on the drum and tighten down the set screws, it's a good idea to take a pair of vice grips, clamp it around the rod, and put it against the header of the garage door to hold that rod in place so you can tighten down the drum on the other side. The sequence for the other side is going to be identical to the first. You're going to spin that drum and get the same amount of tension on the cable as the other side. Then go through the same tightening sequence on the drum with the set screws. Take them down until they hit the rod. Go a half turn, go to the other one, do the same thing. Then go back to the first one, go another quarter turn. To the second one, do that quarter turn, and you are done. So before doing the disassembly, I recommend taking pictures of everything with your phone. A lot of times those pictures will come in handy when you're going back together with something as a reference. I've done this several times because I pretty much video record everything that I'm doing these days for these videos. And I've either used those videos for a reference later during assembly, or I've seen something when I'm editing my video that I actually did incorrectly and I went back and fixed at a later point. As far as making sure you have wound the cable correctly on the drum or pulley, there's two things to look for. The pulleys have a groove that pretty much tells you exactly which direction to go. You will be able to see it. The other thing is, if you have any doubts, that cable should come off the pulley and go in as straight of a line as possible with the connection point at the bottom of the garage door. Once I had both pulleys locked down with equal tension on the cable on each side, then I went ahead and tightened the bolts to the center bracket to that bearing. Now the reason I waited till this point is because the holes are slotted in that center bracket. So you want to have both rod ends in those bearings so it holds it nice and centered before tightening it down. So now we're going to get into doing the sketchy part of this project. This is some scary shit, and this can be very dangerous. So if you don't feel comfortable with this, I recommend you stop and go ahead and call a garage repair facility to come finish this if you're not confident in what you're doing. So I don't scare very easily, and this had me very nervous by the time it was all said and done. So with the torsion spring on these garage doors, you have to put a preload on the spring because that's what it assists in lifting the weight of that garage door. So what I ended up using to do this was two 3/8 extensions that were 2 foot long. I don't recommend doing it with anything that's less than 18 inches long because you will need that leverage. When you first start winding that spring, it's going to be pretty easy to crank, but the tighter you get, the more resistance is going to go against you, and it does get very difficult towards the end of the rotation. So there are 4 holes in these torsion springs, and that's where I'm inserting the 3/8 extensions in order to crank that torsion. You can also go on Amazon, and I highly recommend getting the proper tools to do this. And if this tells you anything, if I ever do one of these springs again, I will be ordering those tools, and I will not do it without them. If you do choose to try and use something besides the proper tool, you need to make sure it's made of a hardened steel and not a mild steel. By the time I was done putting the tension on this spring, those 2 3/8 extensions were bending in the center, and you'll notice that in the video. You also want to make sure whatever you choose fits in those holes very snugly so there's no chance of slippage. After doing this project, I went back to work and was talking to a guy who helped out a buddy of his to do one of these, and they were using something that was less than a foot long and very sloppy in the hole, and it actually came off while they were trying to torsion this spring, and it went through the rear window of the vehicle that was in the garage. So now that I went through my little safety spiel, which is what I felt I needed to do in this video, guys, I'm going to explain how I did this. So this process isn't very complicated, it's just kind of sketchy. So basically you take your first bar, put it in one of the holes, and put a quarter turn crank on it. Then you will be able to put your next rod or bar in the next hole, put tension on that one, and you will repeat this process. Now, when I was at the garage door facility that I bought the spring from, basically they said with this spring, if I have a 7-foot door, I'm going to put 29 quarter-inch turns on it. And if I would have had an 8-foot tall garage door, I would have put 33 quarter turns on it. So I had everybody in my household counting the revolutions I was doing, so I didn't lose track. The good news is if you do need a break, you can rest that bar against the garage door and it will hold it. Just make sure when you do that you've got that bar in that hole really well, and you do let it off slowly to make sure it's not going to slip when you completely take your hand off of it. The other thing is, don't have anybody in a line with that bar while you're doing this in case it does slip out, because that could very easily knock somebody on their ass or worse. So right here I'm getting close to the end of the 29 quarter-inch turns that I'm putting on this spring, and you can see how much tension is on that bar. Notice it's bending when I'm putting these final turns on it. That was 26 quarter-inch turns. 27. So when I went to do this, I actually didn't count the first 1/4 inch turn I did because I didn't feel any spring tension, but you do want to start counting from the first time you do it. So I'm actually one above what I'm actually saying in this video. So that's actually 29 1/4 turns, which is what the parts supply warehouse that I got this spring from told me to put it at. And then I went ahead and put one more bar to hold it for the time being. So this was mistake number 2 that I made. The first time I did this, I did not put the vice grips on that rod to hold the cable tension on the drums. So as I was winding that torsion, that rod had actually spun and gotten a lot of slack in those cables. So that's why I'm spinning this rod right now, is taking up the slack in those cables on the drums before tightening down the set screws on the torsion spring. I did take one final look at both drums to make sure that the cable looked like it was wound up properly and about the same tension on both. Then I went ahead and tightened down those set screws in the same tightening sequences as the drums. Basically take that bolt in until it touches the rod, go a half turn, go to the other one, do the same thing, go back to the first one, do another 1/4 turn, and the second one another 1/4 turn, and that's about all there is to it, guys. Now, if you have a dual spring garage, you'll have to do the same procedure for both springs. The other thing to keep in mind is that the 29 1/4 inch turns for a 7-foot and 33 1/4 inch turns for an 8-foot tall garage doors is for this particular spring part number, and different part numbers might have different amounts of 1/4 inch turns that you will need to put on these springs. When loading these springs, you should be pushing up towards the ceiling with the bars, and the spring tension should be pushing you back against the garage door. And that goes the same for the left spring or the one on the right hand side. So pushing towards the ceiling, and the spring tension should be pushing you back against the top of the garage door. I took off the pair of vice grips that I had on the door rail. Then I took my second bar, put it in the hole above the one held against the garage, pulled the tension off of that one, pulled it out, and slowly released the second bar, which put the spring tension on that rod and started holding the weight of the garage door. You can see as I'm letting the tension off of that bar, it actually starts raising the garage door a little bit as it starts to hold the weight of the garage door. So I'm not quite sure how it happened, but the cable on the left-hand side drum actually did come off during this process. So what I ended up doing is putting one of my bars back in that torsion spring, taking some of the weight back off of the door to give my wife enough slack to put that cable up on the drum properly. Once that was on there, then I went ahead and slowly released the tension back off of the bar and onto the garage door. Now keep in mind, at no point did I loosen the set screws that I had already tightened down. I just needed to unload a little bit of spring tension to give my wife enough slack to put that cable back up on the pulley where it had come off. I opened and closed the door manually a couple times to make sure everything felt good and nothing was binding, which would have led to extra load on that spring and might have caused it to break. When lifting your garage door manually, it should be pretty easy to do with one hand. If you are struggling a little bit, you might need to put another 1 or 2 1/4 turns on that spring, and you do that in the same process that we did before. Once I verified everything felt good, I went ahead and engaged that manual release. So when I dropped it down, it would lock into the rail for the electric garage door opener, and then I went ahead and tried that electric garage door opener, and everything was working good. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.